Hey y'all, Caleb here. In today's video, I'm gonna walk you through setting up Prettier configuration in VS Code. Prettier is an extension that I have installed in Visual Studio Code. And as you can see, uh, they say it is an opinionated code formatter. So it helps you have some consistent styling across your code, all of your files. Um, and this is something that you can share with your team. I've talked in previous videos about, right, have the consistent conventions across the team so that you don't run into issues with um, files being reformatted every time you save them. So Prettier has a couple of different ways that you can manage your config for it. And one of them is inside of Visual Studio Code settings. And you've got all the options here that you're going to have by using a config file, which is actually what I'm going to step you through. Um, Now, the reason you would want to use a config file over handling an extension, even if you're doing something like the settings sync extension shown in another video, is that this will actually be part of the source code in the repository. So once you've set this up and you and your team agree on the configuration, um, you're not going to have an issue again because it will handle the formatting for all your files going forward using its config. So uh, I created a GitHub repo for my Prettier configuration, and I'll make sure to post a link to that in the description. But basically, what you do is you're going to copy these three files from this repo into your Angular project. And then you're going to add tslint config prettier to the project because in this case, prettier is extending some of that tslint functionality that already exists. So really, this is prettier for TypeScript, which I'm sure you could use it in other projects, React or something else. In our case, we've only used it in Angular projects, but we found that it works really well. So after you've got the package installed, you're going to want to go into your tslint file and update the extends array to include tslint config prettier. And once you've done that, um, if this is a new project or it's something that you don't necessarily have styling convention set up, you may need to run Prettier against the whole project to clean it up and get everything consistent. And in that case, you would want to install Prettier globally using npmi prettier-g, and then you would want to run Prettier against that project. So first off, editor config is something that you're going to see in a lot of VS Code projects. And this is really just kind of setting a baseline for your expectations. Prettier Ignore is similar to a git ignore, and it's basically telling you files not to format or not to restyle. So we don't care about styling your package files, if you have a yarn lock file, anything in node modules, or your dist folder. And of course, this dist folder is specific to Angular. You may have a different folder depending on what framework you're using, but dist is your distribution folder. And the idea with dist is that once you've bundled up or built your Angular project, that all goes into your dist folder, and that's what you deploy to your website. So we do not want it to touch the files after they've been built. And then here's my config file. And I'll show you here that Prettier has their own site, and they have all the options that you can use as part of your config listed here. And you can dig in and look at them. I'm not going to go into detail on this page. I will add it in the description, so you can dig in further if you want. But I am just going to go over the settings that I have. So I've set the print width to 100. If a line is 100 lines, it's actually going to rewrap or reformat that on save. And if you're working with a larger monitor, 100 lines should be plenty of space without having issues. Tab width and use tabs kind of go together. If you have use tabs turned off, then tab width actually determines the number of spaces that it puts in place of that tab. So if you're just using a regular tab and you hit the tab key and you go to backspace, it's going to backspace the whole tab. If instead you have use tab set to false and you have tab width set to a certain number, when you tab, it's actually going to create the number of spaces you've selected. And so when you go to backspace, it will actually backspace the same number of spaces. And really this is something that's really just dependent on what your team wants to do and what you're comfortable with. So that's a couple of flexible config options. Semi-true is I want to add semicolons after every line by default, right? So I come from a C# background where we use semicolons everywhere. And if you miss one these days, Visual Studio is gonna let you know. But I like having this option just in case I miss one somewhere in my TypeScript, that it will add it for me. Single quotes set to true. The reason I have this set to true is I tend to use double quotes in Visual Studio and C# and single quotes in my JavaScript or Angular. There's kind of just I can tell which is which more easily. And using single quotes in JavaScript, you can actually put double quotes in them without having to escape them, which is a nice bonus, basically. So quote props is putting quotes around properties that need them, right? And you've got a couple of options there. Again, you can look at options. We've set it as needed. Typically, we're going to do that ourselves, but if we happen to miss one, it will only do it as required and not do it on all of them, right? The next one is trailing comma. And some people love having a trailing comma and other people don't. The idea here is that, for instance, if you have, for instance, like this JSON, right? If you have trailing comma, what it's going to do is that at the last line, or for every line in this list, it's going to add, make sure you have a comma at the end, right? For some people, they like that in case they're going to add, when they add a new line, they don't have to worry about missing that comma or whatever. Other people don't. And I'm one of those people who prefer not to have the comma. I think it's cleaner not to have it there. And if I go and add a new line and type stuff in and save it, it's going to most likely automatically add a comma for me there anyway. So it's just cleaner. Bracket spacing is really, the idea is kind of this. If I can get my keys right. So the idea is this versus this, right? So it just adds spacing on either side of your brackets, right? I prefer it because I find it easier to read. But if you want to save that extra space and don't feel that's necessary, then you would turn it off, bracket spacing defaults, and it would make sure that there is no gap there. Error parens, avoid. The idea here is that you have your fat arrow. Um, and I'm not going to go into detail about exactly how this works. That's for another video. But the idea is whether you always have um, these around your parameters coming in, or whether if it's only one, you have this. You can have multiple parameters or multiple data objects that are being passed in. In that case, you would need um, the parentheses around them so that it knows all of these are items that it's using. But when there's only one, I prefer to keep it clean and just have that one without having that extra um, parentheses around it where it's unneeded. Um, Prose Wrap um, is really if you have like a paragraph or a large chunk of text, do you want it to wrap to the next line if it goes past your print width, or do you want to just let it go? And in some cases, Markdown can have issues with you arbitrarily inserting line breaks or the system doing it. But I don't find that to be that big of an issue, and I like it to wrap so I can see everything that I'm working with. So I've set it to preserve because I'm going to have it do it by default. Next item is HTML whitespace sensitivity. And this is basically whether you're keying off your CSS display properties, or the other options are considering whitespace invalid or important or sensitive and not. I always go with CSS because I want to know that when I've set a display property and I'm using that it is being used correctly and that I don't run into any issues. And the last item that I use is end of line. And we've already gone over this when installing Git, but the idea is you have the difference between Windows and Unix line endings, carriage return versus line feed versus the combination of the two. And because I've already set this up in Git, and because the team that I work with are all working on Windows, and we've all got a similar setup, I'm leaving this as auto. But if you have team members that are working in different locations and different OSs, and you want to make sure that you have a consistent line endings, you can choose the different options, and whenever you save a file, it will automatically handle that formatting correctly so that you won't get those big chunks of changes when you open a file that someone else has worked on. So that's our config. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and spun up a new website using Angular CLI. This one's fresh. I haven't done anything to it. And we're just quickly going to step through these items and update the application and show you what we get. So we want to make sure that tslint config prettier is installed for this application. And while it's doing that, I am actually going to copy those prettier config files over. So we're going to do this. And you just put them in the root. And if, for instance, your editor config file already exists, which it will if it's an Angular app, you can just overwrite it. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to go into our Angular app and update the extends array. Now, if you already have a tslint JSON file, this extends will already exist. If you don't, you can basically create one and just copy this whole chunk. But in our case, it already exists. So we're going to replace this extends, which you see it only has the one item, with this array. And we got to make sure we add that, and then we can save it. And you'll see that um, in this case, we're adding to the rules that TSLint uses, right? So we're saying use the recommended ones and then also use these on top of it to make sure that I get the consistent styling that I want. Okay, so we are going to run this command against the new Angular project, and we'll see what we get. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we have Prettier installed globally. And if you don't want to install this globally, you don't have to. You can go into new modules and run it, or you can use some other stuff to get around that. For me, the easiest thing is just to install it globally. Um, and then we're going to grab this, right? And what this is doing is basically just saying that Prettier, I want you to update all the files in this project that have these extensions, right? So we're going to run it. Well, and as you can see, it did actually update a number of our TS files, for instance, our TSLint JSON. So let's go see. So if you can see here, it actually updated this to where it is 4 spaces and does not use tabs. It doesn't mean you can't tab, right? You can tab, but when you tab, it's going to tab the number of spaces you defined in your Prettier config file. Okay, so I think that about wraps it up for this video. If you have any comments, please leave them below, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye, y'all.